it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. A Series of Life-Changing Events by Will Rayne. What lengths would you be willing to go to if you lost that which made you whole? Something that made you complete? The very thing that gave your life meaning? How far would you go to get back that which was taken from you? I was a painter. It was my passion, and it meant more to me than anything else in my pitiful existence. Since I was a child, nothing gave me more pleasure than when I traced my brush across the canvas. Well, of course, when I was a kid, that amounted to little more than crayons scribbling across the pages of my colouring books, but we all start somewhere. As the years passed, I no longer drifted outside of the dark outlines of the playful puppy dogs or rainbow-covered field settings. I even began lining my own creations upon the blank pages of the sketchbooks my mother would purchase for me. As I grew, my art grew with me. By the time I reached the age of 16, my artistic age was far ahead of my physical one. My teachers were astounded by my works that far exceeded their own talents, and by 18 I was sought out by some of the better-known art galleries in the country. I never attended college, as I was already earning far more than the average graduate could even hope to attain. With the fortune I received from even my initial submissions, I was able to purchase a gorgeous house for my mother and a rather pricey loft apartment in the city for myself. I never cared for the concept of fame, so I'd sell my paintings under a number of aliases. My agent frowned at the concept as she considered the name more important than the product, but I never was one to seek the attention of others. Well, it took some convincing, but she finally backed off and allowed me the freedom I required. Regardless of the name assigned to my works, the demand for them was high. Gallery owners from coast to coast would beg my agent for more information as to the true identity of the mysterious artist. But she respected my wishes and never broke her promise to keep my name concealed. I was a multi-millionaire by the time I reached 23, and nobody outside of my small circle of friends had the slightest idea who I was. Mine was a life to be envied, though my only concern was my passion for the craft. It was on the eve of my 30th birthday when my dreams were stolen from me. I generally walk the streets of the city, or take the occasional taxi to get where I needed to go. Being something of an introvert, I didn't spend much time among the public, but there were times I enjoyed sharing some company. I met with a handful of close friends at a restaurant close to my apartment. We spent the night reflecting on days gone by, and the plans we had for those to come. It was a very pleasant evening, and we would not part ways until the hour was late. My solitary walk back to my home should have only taken 20 minutes at the most. But the stranger who pulled me from the path I walked had different plans for me. He demanded anything of value I had on my person, after he became angry at the absence of cash in my wallet. I offered him my watch and the cufflinks I wore, but he didn't appear convinced that they were worth as much as I'd suggested. He became infuriated that I had little more to offer him, so he took it upon himself to beat me with the sawed-off shotgun he held on me. After my face was sufficiently swollen and torn, he spent some time kicking into my gut as I lay bleeding on the ground. In my final plea to the man, I pulled off my watch and held it out in front of me as I begged him to yield his attacks. He appeared to consider this bargaining as an insult, and he fired his gun at the hand I held outstretched. I stared in horrified shock as my hand blew apart before my eyes, while spray from the blast tore into my arm, shoulder, and neck. I couldn't find the ability to scream out as I gazed upon the shredded tissue and jagged bone where a hand used to reside. The shot awoke an array of sounds from neighboring apartments and animals that inhabited the area. Within moments, the flickering blue lights of a nearby patrol car inspired the man to flee and leave me where I lay, bordering on catatonia. I will not get into much detail concerning the following months of multiple surgeries and psychological assistance. The only information relevant to the story I'm telling here is the degree of the injuries I sustained that night. The tissue damage that my arm and shoulder had suffered was significant. Even after multiple surgeries, I had very limited movement across the entire limb, not to mention the hand that was now absent from my wrist. There was no saving that, as it had been completely ruined by the blast. I attempted to train my left hand in the art that had been effortless to my right, but that was a losing battle from the start. I spent millions in my quest to restore what I had lost, but that only proved to bring me closer to destitution. I had lost everything in the world that brought me joy, but my inability to produce my paintings was the most intolerable of my losses. Though I was still far from poverty, the addictions I developed threatened to bring me closer to that very state. It was the pain pills at first, but after they ran out, I sought compensation. Heroin was the next logical step, as it was opioids that began my transition from a barely functioning adult to a drug-addicted burden of a man. My friends and family attempted to intervene in my self-destruction, but I rewarded their concern by forcing them out of my life completely. I considered my life to be unworthy of salvation as I throttled deeper into despair. Nothing mattered to me other than numbing the pain that my existence had become. It was some 5 years after the attack that ripped my life apart that I became the victim of another life-altering event under the moonlight. I rarely left my apartment anymore, but I still had necessities, one of which was intoxication. I'd been frequenting the dingy corner tavern for some weeks before that night. Though track marks still lined my arms, my medicine was not quite treating my anguish as it used to. Of course, I still maintained the addiction, but alcohol would prove an efficient secondary method. And I'd sufficiently obliterated my motor functions by the time the bartender recommended that I leave before he called the police to drag me out. I staggered my way to the door and out into the night. It was late and the city was mostly asleep as I hobbled through the streets. "Yeah, could you help a guy out with a bite to eat?" A voice beckoned as I walked past a row of vacant properties. I could barely focus my eyes on the man who sat upon the steps that led to the doorway of an abandoned storefront. I don't have any cash," I slurred, holding my one working arm out of the side for stability. "Ain't gonna cost you nothing," the man replied, getting to his feet. "Don't have food either," I replied, still struggling to form words. "Oh, I beg to differ," he replied as he snatched me by my shirt collar and pulled me toward him. Although my body was numb and my head loopy, I was well aware of the sharp teeth that penetrated the already scarred tissue of my neck. I felt him drain the blood from the holes he formed before he pushed me to the ground after taking in little more than a mouthful. "Ugh," he sneered as he coughed out the blood he'd just drained. "I could tell you were a drunk. What a junkie, too," he spat. I struggled to gather myself up while holding my shaking hand over the open wound. "Ugh, it tastes awful. What the hell's wrong with you?" he exclaimed, wiping off his tongue with the bottom half of his shirt. "Wrong with me?" I slurred, staggering back to my feet. "You're the one freaking biting purple. I'll never get this taste out of my mouth," he said, mostly to himself as he scraped at his tongue. The man then turned around and started to walk away, still muttering under his breath. "Wait," I cried out as I hobbled after him. He ignored me and just kept walking. Just finish it," I screamed, forcing one leg in front of the other to the best of my ability. "Kill me, you chicken shit," I yelled as loud as I could. He finally stopped and turned to face me. "Oh, you couldn't pay me to drink another drop of that tainted syrup running through your veins," he growled. "Please," I fell to my knees. "Please, just end it," I begged in the first legible sentence I'd spoken for several hours. Well, the man just stood in place and glared at me. It was impossible to know what he was thinking, but his furrowed brow appeared to soften as he looked upon the pitiful lump of broken human flesh before him. He slowly paced back to me as I sobbed on the ground. After a moment, he crouched down in front of me. He wrapped his fingers across the top of my head and pulled my face up to look him in the eye. "I was like you once," he said, turning my head from side to side as though he were looking for an expiration date. "Just kill me," I whispered. "That what you really want?" he asked. "I can't go on like this," I said, holding up my one hand while struggling to raise the other wrist to meet it. Someone messed you up real good," he remarked as he grabbed my right wrist, which had used to end in 5 fingers. The man reached out to the open wound he'd chewed into before. He ran a finger across it before slicing into it with his fingernail, tearing the hole wider. I could feel the blood freely flow down my shirt, and the idea that my pain was almost over brought me more joy than I expected. "I'm gonna do you a solid, friend," he said as he ran the same fingernail across the palm of his other hand. As fluid spilled from his hand, he wrapped it around the flesh opening in my throat. He just held his hand there for a moment, while he dug his other hand into the inside pocket of his coat. He pulled out a small card and slipped it into my jacket pocket. "When your head clears up some, you give me a call," he said, patting his hand on the pocket he'd just inserted the card into. "We'll talk about you doing me a solid in return." He then pulled his hand away from my neck and stood up. "Fair's fair and all that," he said as he turned around and continued on the path he'd started on before. By the time the stranger turned the corner and left my sight, my head had begun to grow more foggy. I felt my neck to assess the damage, to see only a hint of blood on my hand. Feeling dejected that my worthless life would be continuing, I raised myself up from the ground and made my way back home. Almost as soon as I walked through the doorway to my apartment, my throat began to burn. I staggered forwards, reaching up to the wound, and fell to my knees for the second time that night as an unbearable agony screamed from inside my gut. I clutched my stomach before reaching back to my scalding throat. I felt my useless arm shiver and twitch as it attempted to reach out with fingers it no longer had, and I shouted out and cursed my life until I fell into an unconscious state in the middle of the living room. Well, I'm not entirely sure how long I was out for, but I felt quite remarkable when I awoke. Not only did the complete absence of a hangover surprise me, but I didn't even feel remotely stiff from having slept on the hardwood floor. I immediately headed to the shower after realizing I was incredibly filthy. I repeated my normal pattern of not regarding myself in the mirror, as I couldn't stand to look at what I'd become, though somehow I didn't feel consumed with self-hatred at the moment. After getting myself cleaned up, I couldn't help but notice the complete lack of a wound on my neck. When I took a reluctant glance at my reflection, there wasn't even a scratch. And on top of that, some of the scarring from the shotgun spray was gone from around that area too. For a moment I thought I may have dreamt the events that left me passed out on my living room floor. It wasn't until I retrieved the card from my jacket pocket that I convinced myself it was no delusion of my sleeping subconscious. I picked up my cell phone to place a call to the mysterious individual who'd both chewed on and healed my throat, to see that the date showed it was 2 days later than I would have assumed it to be. My low battery indicator was blinking since it had apparently been some time since it was last fed. After a while, my phone was charged enough to place the call that would hopefully grant me some answers. Well, the fact that I hadn't even sought out my bag of, shall we call it, medication, was a mystery in itself. It had been a long time since I'd allowed my sober mind to be free from a drug-induced state for so long. The conversation was short. The individual, who now introduced himself as Reginald Linus, arranged for me to meet him at a warehouse downtown after nightfall. He gave me no insight to the nature of what this meeting would entail, nor did he grant me any explanation to the events that had transpired between us before. It was sometime after 9 when I arrived at the abandoned building. The place appeared to be completely deserted, and there was no entrance outside of the large dock door that stood open. I walked in to see little more than a wide-open space that indicated no signs of life in the building. Looking good, friend," Linus said as he strolled out from the darkness. "It would seem I have you to thank for that," I replied. It was my first time really seeing the man with clear vision. He looked young, maybe mid-20s at most. He had short, spiky dark hair, and he was pale, paler than anyone I'd ever seen. I looked tan next to him, and I was a drug-addicted recluse that only left my apartment to feed my habits and necessities. He waved his hand for me to follow him. There were no lights illuminating the path ahead, but I could see everything as clearly as if the roof was missing and the sun shone down from above. I followed the man across the empty warehouse until we came to a door at the back of the building. We walked into another open area that was more lit than the room we'd just left. 6 more individuals were sitting on couches or leaning on the counter at the back area. There was a pool table, some arcade machines, and a variety of different styles of chairs and sofas. There was a large TV mounted to the back wall, which currently had cartoons playing on it. "Another stray, Linus?" An attractive brunette called out from the couch. "Ah, you're still my favorite, Katie girl," Linus replied with a wink. "What is all this?" I asked, looking around the room and its inhabitants. There was a tall, muscular, bald man at the bar, a pretty African-American girl beside the brunette on the couch, 2 thin, brown-haired men who looked little older than 18, and another man whose face I could not see as he had his head down on the bar. I could assume that the brown-haired kids were twins, or at least brothers, as they favored each other greatly. Everyone but the guy passed out on the bar stared at me with a host of suspicious expressions on their faces. "This here is my pack," Linus said with his arms spread out beside him. "Pack?" I asked, curious as to what qualified them as such. "Oh, you gotta know what's going on by now," Linus stated with an unsettling smirk. "Your neck's all healed up now. That ain't exactly modern medicine, you know," he continued. I knew what he was getting at, the way he'd bitten into the flesh of my throat, the fact that I showed no signs of any tissue damage after the introduction of his blood into mine. It wasn't difficult to put it all together, but I was unsure if I was ready to admit it just yet. "So, if what you're saying is true," I said, suddenly feeling far more nervous than I had before. "If becoming like you healed my neck," I continued, "then why—" I couldn't quite finish the sentence. I just moved my ruined arm as much as I could and looked down at it. "Well, you ain't exactly one of us just yet, friend," Linus said. "You gotta have one good meal before it really takes a hold of you," he continued with a mischievous smile. Finally, the veil was completely lifted from my eyes. I knew exactly what he meant by one good meal. Maybe I was fooling myself to think that one little blood transfer would put Humpty Dumpty back together again. "If I, have a good meal, as you say," I said, feeling a trembling develop under my skin. "Will it make me whole again?" I asked, holding back the welling in my eyes to the best of my ability. Ain't exactly that simple, friend," Linus said after studying my face for a moment. "Yeah, those injuries are long since healed, you see," he continued. Of course not," I thought. I hung my head as sadness began to creep back upon me. I wasn't completely sure if I was willing to go to such lengths to feed on another person to repair my broken body and mind, but I had hope for a moment. "I said it ain't as simple as taking your first bite, friend. Didn't say it wasn't doable." Linus smiled widely as he spoke. "What?" I replied, genuinely lost for words. The wounds are old, kid. You want a new arm out of the deal, you just gotta make 'em new again, he said. How would that work? I asked, suddenly struggling to form words. A lot easier than you'd think, he replied. Of course, if you ain't interested, you can just turn around right now and you'll be back to your old self before you know it, he said, with a half smile and a shrug. Well, my thoughts were scattered. Was it really possible I could be my full self again? That I could possibly regain some manner of a grip on my old life? Would my necessity to feed on the lifeblood of others be a burden I could live with if I chose this path? Questions. Too many questions. What about what I owe you? I continued, fearing that I'd be getting more in debt to this man. Oh, we'll get to that soon enough, he said. I mean, would this add to that? I felt selfish in my request, but I already feared what my payment would be for just a taste of the life I could have. This one's on the house, he said, with an expression on his face that I couldn't read. Besides, you ain't no good to me like that. He gestured to my twitching arm. So, when? I mean, how? What do I need to do? I stammered out a mess of irrational questions all at once. Does that mean you're in? He asked, tilting his head and giving me a sideways look. Oh, the temptation was too great. My life had been meaningless for too long. I couldn't bear the idea of returning to the needle and the bottle, just to be able to barely cope with the burden of life. Whatever it takes, I didn't care anymore. I am, I replied, holding my head up, mimicking pride in my decision. Oh, when can we start? I asked. No time like the present. Linus smiled with sinister purpose in his eyes. He gave a nod to the big guy at the bar. The hulking man walked over to me and wrapped his thick arms around my body and left arm. I struggled to break free, but his strength far exceeded my own. What the hell? I exclaimed. Katie girl, be a dear and go fetch a little something from the pantry for our new friend, Linus said without acknowledging my outburst. The brunette lifted herself up from the couch and headed towards the door on the left. After a few moments she returned, pushing a gurney with an older gentleman strapped down to it. He appeared unconscious and had a drip running to his arm that led to a bag of clear fluid that hung from an attachment on the side of the rolling bed. Linus walked up to me and looked me in the eye. I struggled against the beast who had his meat hooks around me, but my efforts showed absolutely no reward. You want it quick or easy? Linus asked. What? I stuttered, feeling my heart race as though it wanted to burst out of my chest. To be whole again, he said, raising his eyebrows. I was hoping you'd say that, Linus said with a wink. Before I could even think about saying another word, he grabbed my arm with his right hand. He pulled it out to the side and reared back with his other hand. He slammed his open palm into my shoulder, causing me to scream out in agony as I felt the bone dislocate. He then grabbed at my limb with both hands as he spun to face away from me with my outstretched arm held behind his head as though he were about to cast a fishing line into a still lake. With one quick motion, I felt the damaged and scarred tissue of my shoulder tear apart as he heaved his grip forward, detaching my appendage from my torso. And I shouted out from the disbelief and horrified shock of my arm being torn away from me. I felt my legs give out as the large man held me in place. Linus threw my limb to the floor and dug the fingernails on both of his hands into the remaining shredded meat of my shoulder before tearing away the tissue that remained. Don't go passing out on me, he snarled as he pulled the gurney towards where I was barely hanging on to my ability to remain conscious. With one swipe, he tore apart the throat of the old man that lay before me, and the one who held me upright pushed me down so that my mouth made contact with the gushing wound. "Drink!" Linus screamed out. Our new instincts took over, and I buried my face deep into the tattered open throat and allowed the dark blood to spray into my gaping maw. As I drained the old man, I felt new life blossoming from inside me. Pure, exhilarating ecstasy rushed through my veins as I ingested the thick fluids. I'd never felt so alive. I felt no pain. I felt no suffering. No meal that ever graced my lips before this day fulfilled me as much as this singular moment. Over the hour or so that passed after the brutal removal of my tarnished limb and the subsequent meal that followed, I found myself lost for words. The ground beef that rested where my shoulder and arm used to be had already stopped bleeding, and I felt a heavy pulsing on my right as the tissue had already begun to regrow. Once I found my voice again, I looked up at Linus from where I sat on the floor. Oh, what was the easy way exactly? I asked with a weary smile. "We would have put you out for a bit and cut it off with a hacksaw," he said with a shrug. We just stared at each other for a moment before he burst out laughing so hard his eyes began to water. "How the hell is that easier?" I asked, joining him in a loud belly laugh. "Easier for you. Shit-ton more work for us," he replied, wiping the tears from his eyes. As the night progressed, Linus explained the nature of my debt to him. I would be required to join his pack and shed the life I'd lived before. He seemed to think this would be a much tougher pill to swallow than it actually was. Well, I'd long since abandoned the life I used to cherish, so this would not be much of an adjustment on that particular front. As we continued to discuss my new circumstances, he explained that my arm would begin to rebuild itself over the course of the next week or two. It would take time for it to fully take shape again, but time would seem far less relevant now. We took a brief tour of our shared living space, and my new pack introduced me to what they called the pantry. It was a wide room that held victims they would induce into a coma. They stored food in there as a squirrel would stash away meals for the winter. Well, it was an efficient way to ensure they would never go hungry during the times of the year when less people walked the streets at night. Linus told me he would teach me to hunt and to feed. He would also show me how to use the abilities I would manifest soon after my transformation, and even how to defend myself against those who hunt our kind. Though all of the information I was given was a lot to take in, I only asked him one question in return. "Will I be able to paint again?" "Don't see why not," he shrugged. "Oh, the place could use a bit of decorating anyway," he laughed, as did I. As the months that followed went by, I found it surprising how little a toll it took on me to end the lives of others to feed my thirst. I tried to avoid feeding on those who appeared to have lives that were worth holding on to, but I wasn't especially picky when the hunger hit. As Linus requested, I left what little I had left of my old life behind. I did begin to paint again with my newly formed limb. It proved even more talented than the one I'd lost, and the money that quickly poured back in spruced up our little warehouse quite nicely. Some reviews of my work would even mention that I was capable of the most vibrant shade of red they'd ever laid their eyes on. My new agent respected my desire for anonymity as much as my old one had, and I insisted to my roommates that she stay off the dinner table, so to speak. The fact that they benefited from my work as much as I left them little reason to argue against my requests. We even began performing some construction on the old mill to add more levels underground. This would be a vast undertaking that would take many years to achieve, but we weren't getting any older. Before too long, we had a veritable mansion that led 4 stories beneath the earth. I assisted my pack in finding new recruits over the years, and we'd increased our numbers threefold before we even knew it. Well, as time passed, Linus spoke of an uprising that could potentially occur someday soon against the elders who looked on our kind as little more than animals. I assured him that I would stand by him if a fight ever were to arise. He'd become a close and dear friend, as did the other members of our group. Though my greatest passion still lay upon the canvas, my life felt so much more fulfilled than it had done not so long ago. I never could have predicted that I would find the most happiness I ever had known after my soul was set free from my now immortal shell. Regardless of how content I'd become, there was one last personal venture I'd embark on, to locate the man who'd robbed me of my life, long before I gladly walked away from it. "Oh, why are you wasting your time on that, friend?" Linus would ask from time to time as I made my weekly jaunt into the night alone. "Well, he's the last part of my old life that I've still been unable to shed," I'd reply. Truthfully, he understood my motivations, but he'd still insist it wasn't worth the trouble. After all, were it not for that first life-changing event, I would never have found myself where I am today. Not to mention, I may well have ended up as a fresh meal for my good friend without my tainted blood. It was a snowy November night when my quest finally proved fruitful. I barely recognized the man at first, as he was much older than when we'd first met. I followed the same path I had travelled many times before. That time of week was the only time I would allow myself to come close to the area in which I used to live. Truth be told, I didn't even realize it was that very man I'd seen from a distance that night. I'd almost given up that week's search until I quite literally bumped into him in passing. I continued on my stroll until it registered in my mind. I quickly sped back and leapt on him from behind. His head met the concrete and he went out like a light. So I took the opportunity to carry him to the very alley at which he tore my dreams from me. It was our special place, after all. I watched over him until he awoke, and when he came around, I had a little talk with him. He begged for his life, after he accepted that I was who I claimed to be, after I pulled the watch from my wrist to offer him once more. It was the same model that his shotgun had destroyed, along with the hand which held it. The years had not been kind to the man. I ran a finger across the gash the ground had left on his head and sampled the blood that leaked out. Linus had been correct in his distaste for how the drugs affected the flavor. Perhaps I would leave this individual to dwell in the misery of his own making after all. It wasn't until I turned to leave the alley with the full intention of never returning again that a question dawned on me. How had I not paid attention to this the first time we met, I wondered. It could have just been the shock of the gun that was trained on me that caused me not to notice this one simple thing. So I turned back to the wretched man who still wept on his knees. "Before I go, would you be so kind as to answer a question for me?" I asked as he stared up at me with eyes that swelled with fear. "Are you, left-handed or right?" "Well, as a good friend once told me, fair's fair and all that." So, a pretty good question, really. What would you do to get the life that you wanted, the life that you once had? Get it back in all its glory. It really is a tantalizing dilemma, isn't it? I don't know what I'd do, to be honest. Probably quite a lot, to tell you the truth. Well, yeah, that's it for your Monday evening's entertainment. Still feeling a little bit under the weather, to be honest with you, so apologise for the shorter story this evening, but one hell of a good one I hope you agree. So that is me for this evening. I'm still working on lots of big projects, and they're coming up, I promise you. So, something good on Wednesday evening as well. Something I think you're really going to enjoy. Till then, my dear friends, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.